In the harsh Wyoming Territory of 1888, survival meant minding your own business. But when Josie Carrigan, a heavily pregnant widow barely scraping by as the town seamstress, discovered a badly injured stranger unconscious near her property line, she couldn't walk away. Despite having nothing to spare and winter closing in, she dragged the beaten man into her modest cabin and nursed him back to health through fever and broken ribs. What Josie didn't know was that she'd just saved Whit Maddox, heir to one of the territory's largest ranching empires. Her act of mercy would cost her everything when rumors spread and her landlord threw her out for housing a man alone. But when Whit learned what she'd sacrificed for a stranger, he made her an offer that would change both their lives forever. But would a woman who'd lost everything for doing what's right accept help from the very man who'd caused her ruin? The first light of dawn crept through the thin curtains of Josie Carrigan's one-room cabin, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor. She shifted carefully in her narrow bed, her swollen belly making even the simplest movements a deliberate effort. 7 months along now, and the baby seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. Her hand instinctively moved to the simple gold band on her finger, Samuel's ring, the only thing of value she owned besides the weathered leather sewing kit he'd left her. Outside, the wind howled across the Wyoming Territory with the promise of another harsh winter. Josie pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders and padded to the small window. The town of Cedar Falls stretched before her, a collection of weathered buildings that seemed to shrink a little more each month as families packed up and headed east. The silver boom that had brought hope to this corner of the territory had dried up faster than a summer creek, leaving behind empty storefronts and bitter memories. Her breath fogged the glass as she peered toward Main Street. Even from this distance, she could see the for sale signs hanging like surrender flags from half the businesses in town. The mercantile still operated, though old Henrik counted every penny twice before making change. The saloon remained busy enough, filled with men who'd run out of places to go and dreams to chase. But the dress shop had closed last month, taking with it Josie's steadiest source of work. She moved to her small table, where Samuel's sewing kit waited like an old friend. The leather was cracked and softened by years of use, first in his hands as he'd mended harnesses and gear for the mining operation, then in hers as she'd learned to transform it into her lifeline. Inside, the needles and thread were arranged with the precision of a craftsman. Samuel had been particular about his tools, and she'd honored that memory by maintaining the same careful order. "Well, old friend," she murmured, running her fingers over the worn leather. "What do we have today?" 3 dresses waited for her attention-mending work that would bring in enough to buy flour and beans for another week, maybe 2 if she was careful. Mrs. Patterson's blue cotton dress needed the hem taken in after she'd lost weight during her husband's illness. The banker's wife required delicate work on a torn sleeve lace that would take steady hands and good light. And there was Sarah Mitchell's wedding dress, a rush job that would pay better than the rest combined if Josie could manage the intricate beadwork despite her growing fatigue. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she sat, mending other women's dreams, while her own life seemed to unravel thread by thread. But Samuel had taught her that honest work was its own dignity, and every stitch she made was a small act of defiance against the circumstances trying to pull her under. A sharp knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Josie's heart-skipped visitors were rare and rarely brought good news. She wrapped her shawl more securely around herself and opened the door to find Mrs. Henley, her landlord, standing rigid in the morning cold. Adelaide Henley was a woman who wore disapproval like other people wore jewelry prominently and with great attention to detail. Her steel-grey hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the wrinkles from her forehead, and her dark eyes held all the warmth of a winter storm. She owned half the remaining buildings in Cedar Falls, a fact she never let anyone forget. Mrs. Carrigan. The title came out clipped and formal, as if acknowledging Josie's widowed status was a personal inconvenience. "I trust you have this month's rent?" Josie's stomach clenched. She'd been hoping for another week, time to finish the wedding dress and collect payment. Mrs. Henley, if I could just have until... The first of the month was 3 days ago. Mrs. Henley's voice could have cut glass. I've been more than patient, given your circumstances. Her gaze flicked meaningfully to Josie's belly. But patience doesn't pay my taxes or put food on my table. I understand, ma'am. I have work lined up that'll more than cover it. Just a few more days. A few more days, then a few more after that. Mrs. Henley stepped closer, her presence filling the doorway like a storm cloud. I've heard this song before, Mrs. Carrigan. From the Hendersons before they disappeared in the night. From the Pratts before they lost their farm. Hard times make for hard choices. Josie felt the baby shift restlessly, as if sensing her distress. She placed a protective hand over her stomach, drawing strength from the life growing within her. What are you saying, Mrs. Henley? I'm saying I have other prospects for this cabin. The new schoolmarm is arriving next week, and she'll pay 2 months in advance. Cash money. Mrs. Henley's smile was thin as winter ice. You have until week's end to settle your account, or you'll need to find other accommodations. The words hit Josie like a physical blow. Where would she go? There wasn't another rental property in town she could afford, and winter was already showing its teeth. The thought of being homeless with a baby coming filled her with a cold terror that had nothing to do with the weather. Mrs. Henley, please. I've been a good tenant. I've never caused trouble, never been late before the mine accident. The mine accident was 8 months ago, Mrs. Carrigan. Grief is a luxury none of us can afford for long. Mrs. Henley adjusted her shawl with sharp, efficient movements. I'm not running a charity. This is business, plain and simple. After the landlord left, Josie sank into her chair, hands trembling as she tried to process what had just happened. The wedding dress seemed to mock her from the table beautiful work that would pay well, but not well enough and not fast enough to save her home. She picked up her needle and began to work, focusing on the familiar rhythm of stitching to calm her racing heart. Each tiny bead had to be placed with precision, each thread pulled with just the right tension. It was meditative work, the kind that allowed her mind to wander while her hands stayed busy. Samuel would have known what to do. He'd always been the practical one, the planner who thought 3 steps ahead. He'd have found a solution, some way to stretch their resources or charm Mrs. Henley into patience. But Samuel was gone, buried in the little cemetery on the hill with the other men who'd died when the mine shaft collapsed. As the morning wore on, other sounds of the dying town filtered through her thin walls. The baker's delivery wagon rattled past, half empty these days. Mrs. Chen swept the steps of her boarding house, though few travelers stopped in Cedar Falls anymore. Children's voices echoed from the schoolyard, fewer each month as families moved away in search of better prospects. Pastor Williams appeared at her window around midday, his kind face creased with concern. She let him in gratefully. He was one of the few people in town who'd shown her consistent kindness since Samuel's death. "Josie, child, you look pale. Are you eating enough?" His voice carried the gentle authority of a man who'd spent decades caring for lost souls. "I'm managing, Pastor, just tired." She gestured to the dress spread across her table, trying to finish this before the Mitchell wedding. Pastor Williams studied her face with the practiced eye of someone who'd counseled the desperate and the broken. "Adelaide Henley was seen leaving here this morning with a face like thunder. Should I be concerned?" Josie's composure finally cracked. The whole story tumbled out: the overdue rent, the ultimatum, the fear of having nowhere to go when winter truly set in. Pastor Williams listened without judgment, occasionally nodding or making soft sounds of sympathy. "The church has a small emergency fund," he offered when she finished. "It's not much, but it might buy you time." "I can't take charity, Pastor. It wouldn't be right." Josie's pride flared even as desperation clawed at her heart. "Samuel always said a person should stand on their own 2 feet. Samuel also said a person should accept help when it's offered in the right spirit." Pastor Williams leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped together. "Pride is a fine thing, Josie, but it's poor company on a cold night." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken possibilities hanging between them. Finally, Pastor Williams rose to leave, but paused at the door. "There's always room in the church for those who need shelter," he said quietly. "It's not mucha cot in the back room, access to the kitchen, but it's warm and dry, and the Lord knows you'd be welcome." After he left, Josie returned to her sewing with renewed determination. The afternoon light slanted through her window, illuminating the intricate beadwork on Sarah Mitchell's dress. Each tiny crystal caught the light like a promise, like hope made tangible in thread and fabric. As evening approached, she lit her oil lamp and continued working. The baby kicked restlessly, reminding her that time was running short in more ways than one. She whispered soft words to her unborn child, promises that somehow, some way, she would find a way to provide the security and love every baby deserved. The wind picked up as darkness fell, rattling her windows and finding every crack in the cabin walls. Josie banked her small fire. Carefully, coal was expensive, and she had to make every lump count. Tomorrow, she would finish the wedding dress, collect her payment, and figure out how to stretch it far enough to buy her more time. She was reaching for her shawl to prepare for bed when she heard it, a low moan carried on the wind, almost human but somehow different. Josie froze, listening intently. There it was again, weak but unmistakable. Someone was hurt, and they were close. Against every instinct screaming at her to stay inside, to keep her door locked and her problems to herself, Josie Carrigan reached for her lantern. Samuel's voice echoed in her memory. "Sometimes doing right ain't the same as doing smart, but it's always the thing to do." She pulled on her boots and stepped into the night, not knowing that this single act of compassion would change everything, that the stranger crying in the darkness would turn her world upside down in ways she could never imagine. The wind swallowed her footsteps as she made her way toward the sound. Guided by nothing but the flickering light of her lantern and the unshakable conviction that leaving someone to suffer alone was not the kind of person she wanted to be. Behind her, the cabin sat empty, Samuel's sewing kit waiting patiently on the table, ready for whatever morning would bring. The lantern cast dancing shadows across the uneven ground as Josie made her way carefully toward the sound. Her breath came in visible puffs, and each step sent a sharp reminder through her back about the weight she carried. The moaning had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that made her wonder if she'd imagined the whole thing. She almost turned back twice. The sensible part of her mind, the part that sounded remarkably like Mrs. Henley, reminded her that a pregnant woman had no business wandering around in the dark, looking for trouble that might well find her first. But Samuel's voice was stronger, and it pulled her forward with the steady insistence of conscience. The stranger lay crumpled near the old fence line that marked the boundary of her small property, barely visible in the weak circle of lantern light. At first glance, she thought he might be dead. He was so still, so unnaturally positioned against the weathered fence post. But as she drew closer, she could see the shallow rise and fall of his chest, the way his fingers occasionally twitched against the frozen ground. "Dear Lord," she whispered, kneeling beside him as carefully as her condition would allow. He was a big man, tall and broad-shouldered, though it was hard to tell much about him in the darkness. His clothes were torn and dirty, but even in the lamplight she could see they'd once been fine, the kind of fabric that spoke of money and position. His dark hair was matted with blood from a gash along his temple, and when she gently touched his shoulder, he groaned without opening his eyes. "Sir, can you hear me?" Her voice seemed small against the vastness of the Wyoming night. No response, just that labored breathing that told her he was hurt worse than she'd first thought. Josie held the lantern higher, trying to assess the damage. His vest was torn and bloodied, revealing angry bruises across his ribs. His left arm lay at an odd angle that made her stomach clench in sympathy. Someone had beaten this man severely, then left him to die. The smart thing, the safe thing would be to go back to town, wake Pastor Williams or the doctor, let someone else deal with this stranger's problems. But the nearest help was a 20-minute walk in the best of circumstances, and in her condition, on this uneven ground, it would take longer. The man might not have that kind of time. Josie made a decision that would haunt and bless her for the rest of her life. "Come on then," she murmured, setting the lantern down and working her hands under his shoulders. Let's get you somewhere warm." Moving him was like trying to relocate a mountain. Even unconscious, he was dead weight, and her pregnant body protested every inch of the way. She had to stop 3 times to catch her breath, her back screaming and the baby pressing uncomfortably against her ribs. But somehow, through sheer determination and frequent prayers, she managed to half drag, half carry him to her cabin. Getting him inside was another ordeal entirely. The doorway seemed to shrink as she maneuvered his unconscious form through it, and by the time she had him stretched out on her small rug before the fireplace, she was gasping with exhaustion. Her nightgown was stained with his blood, and her hands shook from the effort. But he was inside, and he was still breathing, and that was what mattered. Josie built up the fire first, coaxing the coals back to life and adding precious fuel until the flames cast a warm glow across the room. Then she fetched her wash basin and the cleanest rags she could find, settling beside the stranger to begin the delicate work of assessing his injuries. In the firelight, she could see him more clearly. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30, with strong features that spoke of good breeding and regular meals. His hands, when she examined them for injuries, were calloused but clean, the hands of a man who worked but wasn't desperate. The fabric of his torn vest was wool of a quality she'd only seen in her sewing work for the banker's wife. This was no ordinary drifter. She started with the head wound, carefully cleaning away the dried blood to reveal a nasty gash that had bled freely but didn't appear life-threatening. As she worked, she found herself studying his face in the dancing firelight. Even unconscious and battered, there was something compelling about him, a strength in the line of his jaw, a hint of character around his eyes that suggested depths she couldn't fathom. "Who are you?" she whispered as she bandaged the cut with strips torn from her oldest chemise. "And what brought you to my doorstep?" His ribs were the real concern. When she carefully opened his vest and shirt, she found angry purple bruises spreading across his chest like a map of violence. She'd seen enough injuries during Samuel's mining days to recognize the signs of broken bones, and at least 2 of his ribs felt wrong under her gentle probing. The stranger stirred as she wrapped his ribs with what remained of her chemise, muttering words she couldn't quite catch. His eyes fluttered open for a moment, grey eyes, she noticed, the color of storm clouds, but they were unfocused with pain and fever. He looked at her without really seeing her, then slipped back into unconsciousness. His arm wasn't broken, just badly wrenched, but she fashioned a sling anyway to keep it immobilized. By the time she finished her makeshift doctoring, the fire had burned low again, and exhaustion pulled at her like a tide. She glanced toward her bed, then at the stranger, taking up most of her floor space. The practical thing would be to drag a blanket to the table and try to sleep sitting up, but her back was already protesting the night's activities. After a moment's hesitation, she pulled her quilt from the bed and settled into her chair, wrapping herself as best she could and keeping one eye on her unexpected patient. Sleep came in fitful pieces, broken by the stranger's restless movements and occasional groans. Twice, she had to add wood to the fire when it burned too low. Once, near dawn, he seemed to be trying to say something, his lips moving soundlessly as his head turned from side to side. She knelt beside him, pressing a cool cloth to his fevered forehead. "Elizabeth." The word came out cracked and desperate. "Elizabeth, I'm sorry." Josie's heart clenched. A wife, perhaps, or a sweetheart. Someone who was probably wondering where he was, fearing the worst. She smoothed the cloth across his brow and spoke softly. "Rest now, you're safe." Whether he heard her or not, he seemed to calm at the sound of her voice, settling into a deeper sleep that lasted until morning. When full daylight finally crept through her windows, Josie assessed her situation with the clear-eyed practicality that had gotten her through the past 8 months. She had a severely injured stranger in her cabin, a wedding dress to finish, rent money to find, and a reputation that couldn't afford any more damage than it had already sustained. But as she looked at the man sleeping by her fireplace, his face relaxed in unconsciousness, she felt no regret. Samuel would have done the same thing. In fact, he had done the same thing more than once during their short marriage, bringing home injured miners or travelers in distress. It was who they were, who she still was, despite everything that had happened. The stranger's fever had broken sometime during the night, and his breathing was easier. Color had returned to his face, though the bruises looked even more impressive in daylight. Someone had worked him over thoroughly, and she wondered what kind of trouble he'd been involved in. Gambling debts? A business dispute gone wrong? Or maybe just the random violence that seemed to find men who traveled alone in wild country. She was heating water for tea when he stirred again, this time with more awareness. His eyes opened slowly, blinking against the morning light filtering through her thin curtains. When his gaze found her, moving carefully around her small kitchen, confusion clouded his features. "Where?" His voice was barely a whisper, rough from fever and injury. "You're safe," Josie said, the same words she'd spoken in the darkness. "You were hurt badly. I found you by my fence line last night." He tried to sit up, then groaned and thought better of it. "How badly?" "Broken ribs, I think. Head wound. Your arms wrenched but not broken." She brought him a cup of weak tea, kneeling beside him to help him drink. "You'll live, but you need rest." As he sipped the tea, she saw him taking in his surroundings, the small cabin, her simple furnishings, her obviously pregnant state. His brow furrowed as if he was trying to piece together how he'd ended up here. "You shouldn't have," he said finally. "A woman in your condition. It wasn't safe." "Maybe not," Josie agreed. "But I couldn't leave you there to die." Something in her tone made him look at her more carefully. In the full light of morning, she could see intelligence in those grey eyes, along with a wariness that spoke of hard-won caution. This was a man who wasn't used to accepting help from strangers, she realized. Someone accustomed to being the one in control. "What's your name?" she asked. He hesitated long enough that she wondered if he would answer. "Whit," he said finally. "Whit Maddox." The name meant nothing to her, but something in the way he said it suggested it should. She filed the information away for later consideration. "I'm Josie Carrigan." She helped him finish the tea, then settled back in her chair. "What happened to you, Mr. Maddox?" Again that hesitation. "Business disagreement. Nothing for you to worry about." She let it pass. Everyone had secrets, and she wasn't fool enough to think a stranger would trust her with his after one night of care. But as she watched him struggle to find a comfortable position on her hard floor, she made a decision that would echo through both their lives. "You can stay until you're well enough to travel," she said quietly. "It's not much, but it's warm and dry." Whit Maddox looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable passing across his bruised features. "You don't know anything about me. I could be dangerous." "You could be," Josie agreed, "but I don't think you are." "What makes you so sure?" She considered the question seriously. A dangerous man wouldn't have apologized to Elizabeth in his fever dreams. A shadow crossed his face at the mention of the name, confirming her guess that Elizabeth was someone important to him. But he didn't explain, and Josie didn't push. Some wounds were too private for sharing with strangers, no matter how kindly meant their care. Outside, the wind was picking up again, rattling the windows and reminding her that winter was coming, whether she was ready or not. Inside her small cabin, a stranger was healing from violence she didn't understand, while her own life hung in the balance of rent money she didn't have, and a future that grew more uncertain with each passing day. But for this moment, in the warm glow of her fireplace, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. The simple satisfaction of having done what was right, regardless of the cost. Samuel would have been proud, and that knowledge was worth whatever trouble might follow. As Whit Maddox drifted back into healing sleep, Josie returned to her sewing. The wedding dress waited patiently on her table, its intricate beadwork catching the morning light like promises of better days to come. The second day brought complications Josie hadn't anticipated. Whit was conscious more often, which meant he was aware of the cramped quarters and the inconvenience his presence caused. Every time she had to step around him to reach her sewing table or stoke the fire, she caught him watching her with those thoughtful grey eyes, and she could practically feel his discomfort at being helpless. "I should go," he said for the third time that morning, struggling to prop himself up on his good elbow. "This isn't proper, and you've done enough." "You can barely sit up without turning green," Josie observed mildly, not looking up from Sarah Mitchell's wedding dress. "Where exactly do you think you're going to go?" He didn't have an answer for that, which seemed to frustrate him even more. She was beginning to understand that Whit Maddox wasn't a man accustomed to depending on others, especially not a pregnant widow he'd known for less than 2 days. His clothes, when she'd hung them by the fire to dry after washing out the blood, had confirmed her suspicions about his circumstances. The fabric was expensive, the tailoring precise. The boots alone probably cost more than she spent on food in 3 months. But it was the small things that really caught her attention. When he'd reached for the water cup that morning, she'd noticed his hand scallowed, yes, but with the particular patterns of someone who handled fine leather and quality tools. When he spoke, his voice carried the educated cadence of a man who'd had schooling and read books. And once, when the wind had rattled her windows particularly hard, she'd seen him glance toward the door with the alert attention of someone used to watching for trouble. "You're not from around here," she said, threading her needle with silver thread for the delicate work around the dress's neckline. "No." The answer came after a pause, and she could feel him studying her as she worked. "You're very skilled at that." She smiled at the obvious deflection. "My husband taught me. He was good with his hands, could mend anything that needed mending. After he died, it seemed natural to keep using his tools. I'm sorry for your loss." The simple words, spoken with genuine sympathy, caught her off guard. Most people either avoided the subject of Samuel's death entirely or offered platitudes that felt hollow. But there was something in Whit's tone that suggested he understood loss personally. "Thank you," she said softly. "It's been 8 months now. Some days are easier than others." They worked, she at her sewing, he at the careful business of healing, in comfortable silence for a while. The morning light slanted through her windows, illuminating the intricate beadwork she was creating. Each tiny crystal had to be placed just so, the thread tension perfect to create the flowing pattern Sarah Mitchell had requested. "How much longer until?" Whit gestured vaguely toward her belly. 2 months, maybe a little less." Josie smoothed her hand over the curve where the baby rested. "It's hard to be sure. You must be looking forward to meeting him, or her." She paused in her stitching, considering the question. "I am, but I'm frightened too, if I'm honest. Bringing a child into the world when you're not sure where you'll be living from 1 week to the next. It's not what I'd planned." The admission slipped out before she could stop it, and she immediately regretted the show of vulnerability. This stranger didn't need to hear about her troubles with Mrs. Henley or her dwindling resources. But when she glanced at him, she saw understanding rather than pity in his expression. "Plans have a way of changing without asking our permission," he said quietly. Something in his tone suggested he was speaking from experience, but before she could ask what he meant, a sharp knock at her door interrupted the moment. Josie's stomach clenched. She knew that authoritative rap. Mrs. Henley, making her rounds earlier than usual. "Stay quiet," Josie whispered to Whit, then called out, "Just a moment." She opened the door only wide enough to see Mrs. Henley's disapproving face, keeping her body positioned to block the view of the interior. But her landlord wasn't easily deterred. "Mrs. Carrigan, I saw smoke from your chimney very early this morning, and yesterday, unusual for someone so concerned about conserving fuel." "I've been working on a rush order," Josie said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "The Mitchell wedding dress. It requires good light and warm fingers." Mrs. Henley's sharp eyes tried to peer past her into the cabin. "Of course. And I suppose that would also explain why young Tommy Patterson saw you wandering about with a lantern 2 nights ago. At an hour when decent women are in their beds?" Josie's heart hammered against her ribs. Had someone seen her helping Whit? "I thought I heard something. A cat perhaps in distress. You know how sound carries on the wind." "Indeed." Mrs. Henley's tone suggested she didn't believe a word of it. "Well, I'm sure you won't mind if I come in for a moment. I wanted to discuss the terms of your departure, since you'll be vacating soon." The request was phrased politely, but Josie heard the underlying threat. If she refused entry, Mrs. Henley would assume she had something to hide. If she allowed it, the woman would discover Whit and draw conclusions that would destroy what remained of Josie's reputation. Behind her, she heard the soft scrape of fabric against wood and realized Whit was moving, trying to find a position that might be less visible from the doorway. Her mind raced, searching for options that didn't exist. Actually, Mrs. Henley, now isn't a good time. I've got the dress laid out, and the beadwork is at a delicate stage. Perhaps this afternoon. Mrs. Henley's eyes narrowed. How convenient. Very well, Mrs. Carrigan. This afternoon, then. Say 3 o'clock? That should give you time to finish your work. After the landlord left, Josie leaned against the closed door, her hands shaking. Whit had managed to move behind her sewing table, but in such a small space, there was nowhere he could truly hide. She suspects something, Josie said. Then I need to leave now, before she comes back. You're in no condition to travel. You can barely stand without swaying. I'll manage. Whit was already trying to get to his feet, though the effort clearly cost him. I won't be responsible for ruining your reputation or getting you thrown out of your home. It's a little late for that, Josie said with bitter humor. Mrs. Henley's been looking for an excuse to evict me since Samuel died. If not this, then something else. She moved to her small window, peering out at the town beyond. A few early risers were already about their business, the baker loading his cart, a rancher heading toward the livery stable. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that her world was crumbling one decision at a time. There might be another way, she said slowly, an idea beginning to form. Pastor Williams mentioned that the church has space if I need it. If I ask him to come check on my health, women in my condition sometimes need spiritual counseling, could examine you properly, maybe help us figure out how to get you somewhere safe to recover. Whit considered this, his hand pressed against his ribs. You'd trust him with this? Pastor Williams is a good man. He's helped me more than once since Samuel died, and he's not one for gossip. Josie turned from the window. The question is whether you trust me enough to let me handle this. Their eyes met across the small cabin, and something passed between them, a recognition of mutual dependence that went deeper than stranger helping stranger. He was risking his safety on her judgment, and she was risking her future on his character. Neither had much choice in the matter, but somehow that made the trust more meaningful, not less. All right, Whit said finally, but if this goes wrong... It won't, Josie said with more confidence than she felt. It can't. As she prepared to slip out and find Pastor Williams, Whit caught her attention with a soft clearing of his throat. When she looked back, he was holding something in his good hand, a silver pocket watch that had apparently fallen from his vest during the night. This fell out earlier, he said, his voice carefully neutral. I thought you should know. Josie stared at the watch. Even from across the room, she could see it was expensive, the kind of timepiece that spoke of serious money and established family. The case was engraved with an intricate design that looked like a family crest. That's quite a watch, she said quietly. It was my father's, and his father's before that. Whit tucked it carefully back into his vest pocket. Some things are worth holding on to, no matter what else changes. The words carried weight beyond their surface meaning, and Josie found herself wondering what changes Whit Maddox had weathered, what losses had shaped the careful reserve she saw in his eyes. But there would be time for such questions later if they both survived the next few hours. I'll be back with Pastor Williams within the hour, she promised, pulling her shawl around her shoulders. Try not to do anything foolish while I'm gone. A ghost of a smile crossed his bruised features. I'll do my best. As Josie stepped out into the crisp morning air, she realized that somewhere in the space of 2 days, this stranger had become important to her in ways she couldn't quite explain. Not just as someone who needed help, but as someone whose presence had awakened something in her that had been dormant since Samuel's death, a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. The thought both thrilled and terrified her as she made her way toward the church, hoping Pastor Williams would prove as understanding as she believed him to be. Pastor Williams arrived within the hour, His weathered face creased with concern as Josie explained the situation in hushed tones outside her cabin door. She'd been deliberately vague about the stranger's identity, focusing instead on the Christian duty to help those in need and her fear that Mrs. Henley would use the situation against her. "You did the right thing, child," Pastor Williams said after she finished her explanation. "Let me examine him and see what can be done." Whit was sitting up when they entered, though the effort clearly pained him. He'd managed to straighten his torn shirt and finger-comb his dark hair into some semblance of order, but nothing could hide the severity of his injuries or the expensive cut of his clothes. Pastor Williams took one look at him and raised his eyebrows. "Well now," the pastor said mildly, "this is interesting." "Sir." Whit's voice carried the wariness of a man used to being recognized when he'd rather remain anonymous. "Nothing to worry about, son. Just that I've seen you before, though you were considerably less battered at the time." Pastor Williams knelt beside Whit with the easy confidence of someone who'd tended to injured men before. "Whit Maddox, isn't it? You spoke at the Cattlemen's Association meeting in Cheyenne last spring." Josie felt her breath catch. She'd heard of the Maddox family everyone in Wyoming Territory had. They owned vast ranches stretching across 3 counties, controlled water rights that made or broke smaller operations, and wielded the kind of influence that reached all the way to territorial government. Whit Maddox wasn't just wealthy, he was Wyoming Territory royalty. Whit closed his eyes briefly, his carefully maintained anonymity crumbling. "Pastor, I take it this isn't a social call to our little town?" Pastor Williams began examining Whit's ribs with gentle, practiced hands. "No, sir, I was." Whit glanced at Josie, then back to the pastor. "I was conducting some business, private business. It didn't go as planned." "I see." Pastor Williams's tone remained carefully neutral. "And you ended up beaten half to death on Mrs. Carrigan's property by pure chance." "Something like that." Josie sank into her chair, her mind reeling. She'd saved Whit Maddox. The heir to one of the largest fortunes in the territory had been lying broken and bleeding by her fence line, and she'd dragged him into a tiny cabin without having any idea who he was. The absurdity of it was overwhelming. "Mrs. Carrigan?" Pastor Williams's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you all right? You've gone quite pale." "I'm fine," she managed, though she wasn't sure that was true. I had no idea." Whit was watching her with an expression she couldn't read. "Does it matter? Who I am, I mean?" The question hung in the air between them. Did it matter? 2 days ago, she'd made her decision based on simple human compassion. Now she was learning that the man she'd risked everything to help could probably buy and sell her entire town without noticing the expense. "I don't know," she said honestly. Pastor Williams finished his examination and sat back on his heels. 2 broken ribs, definitely. Head wound is healing clean. The arm's sprained but not broken. You did fine work, Josie. He'll recover, but he needs time and rest." "Time I don't have," Whit said grimly. "There are people who'll be looking for me. When they don't find my body where they left it, they'll start searching. I can't put Mrs. Carrigan in that kind of danger." "What kind of people?" Pastor Williams asked, his voice taking on the hard edge of a man who'd seen more of the world's darkness than most. Whit hesitated. "Business competitors. Men who think violence is an acceptable negotiating tactic. Cattle rustlers, land grabbers? Something like that." Whit's evasion was obvious, but Pastor Williams didn't push. "Well then," the pastor said, rising to his feet, "it seems we have a problem that requires careful thought." They spent the next hour discussing options, each more complicated than the last. Whit couldn't travel in his condition, but staying put would eventually expose Josie to scrutiny she couldn't afford. Moving him to the church would only shift the problem and potentially compromise Pastor Williams's position in the community. It was Whit who finally came up with a solution, though he seemed reluctant to voice it. "There's a line shack about 15 miles north of here," he said slowly. "Part of the old Henderson spread, been abandoned since they pulled out last year. It's isolated, has a decent roof and a stone fireplace. If someone could help me get there." 15 miles, Josie stared at him. You can barely walk across this room. I can ride if I have to, and it would get me away from here before Mrs. Henley returns." Pastor Williams stroked his beard thoughtfully. "It's not a terrible plan. The Henderson place is well off the main trails. But you'd need supplies, and someone would have to check on you periodically." "I can pay for whatever's needed," Whit said quietly. The offer hung in the air like an uncomfortable reminder of the vast gulf between his circumstances and theirs. Josie found herself bristling at the casual assumption that money could solve every problem. "We're not asking for payment," she said sharply. "This isn't about money." Whit looked surprised by her vehemence. "I didn't mean to offend. I just thought—" "You thought you could buy your way out of trouble, like you probably do everything else." The words came out harsher than she'd intended, fueled by stress and the disorienting revelation of his identity. "Josie," Pastor Williams said gently, but Whit held up his hand. "No, she's right. I'm sorry. I'm not used to this. People helping without expecting something in return." The admission was quiet, almost vulnerable, and it deflated Josie's anger as quickly as it had risen. She looked at this powerful man sitting bruised and broken on her cabin floor and saw something she hadn't expected: loneliness. For all his wealth and influence, Whit Maddox seemed genuinely surprised by simple kindness. "I'm sorry too," she said. "That was uncalled for. It's been a difficult few days." "For both of us," Whit agreed. Pastor Williams cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps we should focus on practical matters. Mr. Maddox, do you have a horse nearby?" "No, they took it, along with most of my gear." Whit's jaw tightened. "I'll need to buy another. The livery stable has decent stock, but Henrik asks questions. Too many questions for a man who needs privacy." Pastor Williams considered the problem. "However, I know a rancher who might be willing to make a quiet sale. Good man, keeps to himself." They spent another hour working out details. Pastor Williams would arrange for a horse and basic supplies. Whit would wait until dark to travel, reducing the chance of being seen. Once he was settled at the Henderson place, Josie would check on him every few days under the pretense of gathering herbs, a reasonable activity for a woman in her condition, especially one with some knowledge of healing. As the afternoon wore on, Josie found herself stealing glances at Whit when she thought he wasn't looking. Knowing who he was should have changed everything, but somehow it didn't. He was still the man who'd apologized to someone called Elizabeth in his fever dreams, still the stranger who'd worried more about her reputation than his own comfort. But she couldn't shake the growing awareness that his presence in her life was more complicated than simple charity. Whit Maddox moved in circles where her existence wouldn't even register as a footnote. When this was over, when he was healed and returned to his proper place in the world, she would go back to being nobody special, a pregnant widow struggling to survive in a dying town. The thought shouldn't have bothered her as much as it did. "Mrs. Carrigan?" Whit's voice interrupted her brooding. "I wanted to thank you, not just for the medical care, but for treating me like a person instead of a name. It's been refreshing." She met his eyes across the small cabin. Everyone deserves to be seen for who they are, not what they own. Something flickered in his expression, surprise maybe, or recognition. Not everyone would agree with that. Then not everyone is worth knowing. The simple statement seemed to affect him more than it should have. He looked at her for a long moment, as if trying to memorize her face, before Pastor Williams returned with news that everything was arranged. As evening approached and they prepared for Whit's departure, Josie felt an unexpected reluctance to see him go. The past 3 days had been the most eventful of her life since Samuel's death, and despite the complications and fears, she'd felt more alive than she had in months. "Be careful," she said as Pastor Williams helped Whit to his feet. "You too. And Mrs. Carrigan?" Whit paused at her door, his hand pressed against his ribs. "If you need anything at all, get word to Pastor Williams. He knows how to reach me." It was a generous offer, but they both knew she was too proud to accept charity from a man who could solve her problems with pocket change. Still, the fact that he'd made the offer meant something. After they left, Josie's cabin felt strangely empty. She returned to her sewing, but found herself listening for the sound of hoofbeats that would signal trouble, and wondering if she'd made the right choice in helping a man whose very presence had turned her quiet life upside down. Outside, Mrs. Henley's footsteps approached for her, promised 3 o'clock visit, and Josie steeled herself for what was sure to be an uncomfortable conversation. Mrs. Henley arrived precisely at 3 o'clock, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of Josie's cabin, as if conducting an inventory. The space felt both too small and too empty too small to hide the lingering evidence of an unexpected visitor, too empty now that Whit was gone. "You look flushed, Mrs. Carrigan," the landlord observed, settling uninvited into Josie's second chair. "I hope you're not overexerting yourself." "Just the usual aches that come with my condition," Josie replied, keeping her hands busy with Sarah Mitchell's wedding dress. The intricate beadwork required steady fingers, and concentrating on the delicate stitches helped calm her nerves. Mrs. Henley's gaze swept the room methodically. "I notice you've been burning more coal than usual, quite extravagant for someone behind on rent. The Mitchell wedding dress requires good light and warm hands. I can't afford to make mistakes on such important work." "Indeed." Mrs. Henley picked up one of Josie's teacups from the small table, examining it with theatrical interest. "2 cups, I see. How thoughtful of you to prepare refreshments for my visit." Josie's heart skipped, but she kept her voice steady. "I had tea with Pastor Williams earlier. He was kind enough to check on my health." "Ah, yes, Pastor Williams. Such a devoted shepherd to his flock." Mrs. Henley set down the cup with deliberate precision. "Though I must say, I was surprised to see him leading a strange horse through town this afternoon, not his usual mount at all." The trap was closing, and Josie could feel it. Mrs. Henley hadn't come here to discuss rent. She'd come fishing for information, armed with observations that could destroy what remained of Josie's reputation if connected properly. "I wouldn't know about that," Josie said. "I've been working all day." "Of course you have." Mrs. Henley's smile was sharp as winter wind. "Tell me, Mrs. Carrigan, have you given any thought to where you'll go when you vacate this property?" The abrupt change of subject was meant to unsettle her, and it worked. "I'm still hoping we can reach an arrangement about the rent." "I'm afraid that's no longer possible. You see, I've already promised the cabin to Miss Thornfield, the new schoolma'am. She's a respectable young woman from a good family in Denver. The kind of tenant this property deserves." The emphasis on respectable was like a slap, and Josie felt her temper flare. "I've been a model tenant for 3 years. I've never caused trouble or damaged your property." "Haven't you?" Mrs. Henley leaned forward, her eyes glittering with malice. "Because I'm hearing the most interesting rumors about your recent activities. Late night, wanderings with lanterns, extended visits from the pastor, unusual amounts of smoke from your chimney at odd hours. One might wonder what sort of activities require such privacy." The accusation hung in the air like poison. Josie set down her needle, her hands trembling with suppressed fury. "What exactly are you suggesting, Mrs. Henley?" "I'm not suggesting anything, my dear. I'm simply observing that a woman in your position must be very careful about appearances. A pregnant widow living alone already raises eyebrows. Any additional irregularities might prove quite damaging to one's reputation." "My reputation is my own concern." "Is it?" Mrs. Henley stood, smoothing her skirts with satisfaction. "Because reputations have a way of affecting more than just the person who owns them. They affect employment opportunities, housing arrangements, the willingness of decent people to associate with someone. A damaged reputation can make life very difficult indeed, especially for a woman about to have a child to support." The threat was clear, even wrapped in polite language. Mrs. Henley was prepared to spread whatever rumors would serve her purposes, truth be damned. Josie thought of Whit, hopefully safe at the Henderson place by now, and realized her sacrifice might have been for nothing if she couldn't protect both their secrets. "What do you want?" she asked quietly. "Simply compliance with our rental agreement. Vacate the premises by week's end, as agreed." Mrs. Henley moved toward the door, then paused. "Oh, and Mrs. Carrigan, I do hope your recent charitable activities haven't left you in need of medical attention. Dr. Morrison is such a gossip, and men can be so indiscreet about the details of their patients' conditions. After the landlord left, Josie sank into her chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of her situation. In 5 days, she would be homeless. The church barn Pastor Williams had mentioned would provide shelter, but barely, and only through the charity she'd spent months trying to avoid. Her reputation hung by a thread that Mrs. Henley could cut at any moment, and somewhere in the wilderness, Whit Maddox was probably wondering if helping him had been worth destroying her life. She returned to her sewing with desperate focus, racing against time to finish the wedding dress that represented her only hope of earning enough money to buy herself options. The silver thread caught the late afternoon light as she worked, each tiny bead positioned with the precision of prayer. 3 days later, she made her first trip to check on Whit. The ride to the Henderson place took longer than expected, partly because she had to travel carefully in her condition, and partly because she'd never ventured so far from town alone. The abandoned homestead sat in a small valley, protected from the worst winds by stands of pine and aspen. Someone had built it with hope. She realized the kind of hope that had drawn thousands of families west in search of better lives. She found Whit chopping wood behind the cabin, moving slowly but steadily. His color had improved dramatically, and though he still favored his injured ribs, he seemed to have regained much of his strength. When he saw her approaching, he set down the axe and came to help her down from her horse. "You shouldn't have come alone," he said, though his eyes suggested he was glad to see her. "It's not safe for you to travel this distance in your condition. I promised I'd check on you." Josie accepted his assistance with gratitude. The ride had been more tiring than she'd anticipated. "How are you healing?" "Better every day, thanks to your care." He studied her face with concern. "You look exhausted and thinner than when I left." She'd lost weight over the past week, stress and worry, stealing her appetite, despite the baby's needs. "I've had some complications." Over a simple meal of beans and hardtack supplies Pastor Williams had provided, she told him about Mrs. Henley's visit and the increasingly precarious nature of her situation. Whit listened without interruption, his expression growing darker with each detail. "She's using you as a scapegoat," he said when she finished, "creating a scandal to justify her actions." "I know, but knowing doesn't change anything." Josie sipped the weak coffee he'd made, grateful for the warmth. "I should have minded my own business. Should have left you where I found you." "Don't say that." His voice was sharp enough to make her look up in surprise. "Don't ever say that. What you did was brave and kind and right. If you're suffering because of it, then the world is upside down." "The world has always been upside down for people like me," Josie said with bitter humor. "I was foolish to think I could change that." "Maybe the world needs more fools then." The quiet intensity in his voice made something flutter in her chest, something she had no business feeling for a man so far above her station. She stood abruptly, needing distance. "I should go. It'll be dark soon, and I don't want to be caught on the trail after sunset." Whit rose too, wincing slightly as his ribs protested. "Josie, wait. There's something I need to tell you." The serious tone in his voice made her pause. "What is it?" "The men who did this to me, they weren't just business competitors. They were working for someone who wants to acquire my family's water rights. Someone willing to use violence to get what they want." He ran a hand through his dark hair. "If they connect me to you, if they realize you helped me." "They'll what? Beat up a pregnant woman?" Josie tried to make light of it, but the fear in his eyes was contagious. "They'll use you to get to me, and they won't care about your condition or your circumstances." Whit stepped closer, his expression urgent. "I need you to promise me something. If anything happens, if anyone comes asking questions about me, if you feel threatened in any way, get word to Pastor Williams immediately. Can you do that?" Josie nodded, though privately she wondered what good a pastor could do against the kind of men who left people for dead by fence lines. "I promise." "Good." Some of the tension left his shoulders. "And Josie, thank you for checking on me, for risking the trip out here. It means more than you know." The ride back to town gave her time to think, and thinking led to uncomfortable realizations. Somewhere in the past week, her feelings for Whit Maddox had shifted from simple compassion to something more complex and dangerous. She found herself looking forward to their brief conversations, treasuring the way he looked at her, as if she mattered, remembering the warmth in his voice when he spoke her name. It was foolishness of the highest order. He was Whitmore Maddox, heir to an empire, and she was nobody, a pregnant widow about to lose the roof over her head. When this was over, when he was healed and returned to his proper world, she would become a memory at best, a cautionary tale at worst. But as she reached the outskirts of Cedar Falls, she realized that logical truth did nothing to stop the ache in her chest or the growing certainty that her life had become irrevocably complicated by forces she couldn't control. The eviction notice was waiting on her door when she arrived home. Official and final and stamped with Mrs. Henley's vindictive satisfaction, 3 days to vacate. 3 days to figure out how to start over with nothing but the clothes on her back and a baby on the way. Josie sank into her chair and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes to feel sorry for herself. Then she picked up her needle and returned to work on the wedding dress that might be her salvation if she could finish it in time. The eviction happened on a grey November morning, as cold and merciless as Mrs. Henley's smile. Josie stood in her empty cabin, holding the small wooden cross Samuel had carved for her during their first winter together. Everything else, her meager furniture, her sewing supplies, the few keepsakes from her marriage, had been loaded onto Pastor Williams's wagon. "You can store most of it in the church basement," the pastor said gently, watching her cradle the cross against her swollen belly, "and the offer of the back room still stands." Josie nodded, not trusting her voice. The back room was barely larger than a closet, with space for a narrow cot and little else. It would shelter her through the winter, but it was charity pure and simple, and the knowledge sat bitter as wormwood in her mouth. Mrs. Henley appeared in the doorway, her efficiency as brutal as her timing. "Miss Thornfield will be arriving this afternoon, so I'll need the key now." The key felt impossibly heavy in Josie's palm as she handed it over. 3 years of memories reduced to a piece of cold metal that no longer belonged to her. Mrs. Henley pocketed it with the satisfaction of someone who'd achieved exactly what she'd set out to accomplish. "I do hope you've learned something from this experience, Mrs. Carrigan," the landlord said with false sympathy, "about the importance of maintaining proper appearances." "Yes, ma'am," Josie managed. "I've learned that some people mistake cruelty for righteousness." Mrs. Henley's eyes flashed, but she said nothing more. There was no point she'd won, and they both knew it. The church back room was as small and depressing as Josie had imagined. Pastor Williams had done his best to make it welcoming, adding a small table and chair, hanging heavy curtains to block the draft from the single window. But it felt like what it was, a refuge for the desperate, a place where people came when they'd run out of other options. "It's just temporary," Pastor Williams assured her as he helped arrange her few possessions. "Once the baby comes and you're back on your feet, we'll find you something better." Josie appreciated the optimism, even if she didn't share it. What landlord would rent to a woman alone with a newborn and no steady income? How would she work enough to pay rent while caring for an infant? The future stretched ahead of her like a maze with no visible exit. That evening, as she lay on the narrow cot listening to the wind rattle the church windows, Josie allowed herself to think about Whit. She'd managed one more visit to the Henderson place before the eviction, ostensibly to gather late-season herbs, but really to see how he was healing. He'd looked stronger, more like the powerful man he was and less like the broken stranger she'd found by her fence. He'd also seemed distant in a way that had nothing to do with his injuries. When she'd mentioned the eviction, he'd gone very still, his hands clenching and unclenching, as if he was fighting some internal battle. "This is my fault," he'd said finally. "All of it. You're suffering because of me." "I'm suffering because people like Mrs. Henley exist," Josie had corrected. "Don't take credit for her cruelty." But she could see the guilt eating at him, and part of her wondered if distance wasn't kindest for both of them. Their worlds had intersected briefly, violently, but they were never meant to stay connected. Better to let him heal and return to his empire while she figured out how to rebuild her life from nothing. 3 days after the eviction, Sarah Mitchell's wedding arrived. Josie watched from the church steps as the bride emerged from her family's carriage, radiant in the dress that had consumed weeks of Josie's life. The beadwork caught the afternoon light like captured stars, and the silk moved with Sarah's steps like liquid moonlight. It was beautiful work, perhaps the finest Josie had ever done, and seeing it worn as intended filled her with pride despite her circumstances. The wedding payment would keep her fed through winter, but barely. She'd have to find other work soon, though options were limited for a woman in her condition. Mrs. Chen at the boarding house might need help with laundry. The saloon owner sometimes hired women to clean in the mornings, before the drinking started. Neither paid well, but pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. After the ceremony, as guests moved toward the reception, a familiar figure approached the church. Josie's heart jumped before she recognized the man at Whit, but a stranger in expensive clothes who carried himself with the confidence of money and power. Mrs. Carrigan. His voice was cultured, Eastern, educated. I wonder if I might have a word. Pastor Williams appeared at her side, his presence protective without being obvious. Is there something we can help you with, Mr. Caldwell? James Caldwell. The man's smile was polished and empty. I represent certain business interests in the territory. I'm hoping Mrs. Plaskes Carrigan might be able to assist me with a small matter. Josie's blood ran cold. What kind of matter? I'm looking for someone. A man who disappeared recently under unusual circumstances. I thought perhaps, given your reputation for charitable work, you might have encountered him. The words were carefully chosen, carrying just enough implication to be threatening without being actionable. Josie felt Pastor Williams tense beside her. I'm afraid I don't know what you mean, she said. Caldwell's smile didn't waver. Of course not. But if you should happen to remember anything, or if this mysterious person should contact you, I hope you'll consider the wisdom of cooperation. Some situations can become quite complicated for those who choose unwisely. Are you threatening Mrs. Carrigan? Pastor Williams's voice carried the quiet authority of righteous anger. Threatening? Certainly not. I'm simply pointing out that information has value, and that value can benefit everyone involved. Caldwell tipped his hat with mock courtesy. Good day, Mrs. Carrigan. I do hope we'll have the opportunity to speak again soon. After he left, Josie sank onto the church steps, her hands shaking. The men Whit had warned her about had found her trail, just as he'd feared. Somehow they'd connected her to his disappearance, and now she was trapped between protecting him and protecting herself. We need to get word to Mr. Maddox, Pastor Williams said quietly. He needs to know they're closing in. How? I can't ride to the Henderson place in my condition, not with winter coming on, and sending someone else would just expose more people to danger. Pastor Williams considered this, his weathered face creased with worry. There might be a way. Old Henrik's nephew sometimes runs supplies to the abandoned homesteads for trapping season. If we could convince him to make a delivery. They spent the next hour working out details, crafting a plan that felt fragile as spun glass. Henrik's nephew could carry a message along with legitimate supplies, but it would take time to arrange, and time was the one thing they might not have. That night, Josie lay awake in her narrow cot, listening to every sound beyond the church walls. Every creak of settling timber might be footsteps. Every wind gust might hide the approach of men who'd already proven their willingness to use violence. She thought of Whit, alone at the Henderson place, unaware that danger was closing in. She also thought about the wooden cross clutched in her hands, the only thing of value she had left from her marriage. Samuel had carved it with the same careful attention he'd brought to everything he touched, and holding it now reminded her of his quiet strength, his belief that doing right was its own reward. But Samuel had never faced men like Caldwell, had never been caught between impossible choices with a baby's future hanging in the balance. As Josie finally drifted toward uneasy sleep, she wondered if doing right was enough when the world seemed determined to punish goodness and reward cruelty. The next morning brought Henrik's nephew with the welcome news that he could carry a message to the Henderson place within 2 days. It also brought Mrs. Henley, her face flushed with indignation and what looked suspiciously like fear. "Mrs. Carrigan," the landlord said without preamble, "I need to speak with you, privately." Pastor Williams started to object, but Josie held up her hand. Whatever had brought Mrs. Henley here, her usual smugness had been replaced by something approaching panic. "What is it?" Josie asked. "That man yesterday, Mr. Caldwell, he came to see me after he spoke with you." Mrs. Henley's voice was tight with suppressed emotion. "He asked very pointed questions about your tenancy, about the circumstances of your eviction. When I told him it was simply a matter of unpaid rent, he seemed disappointed." "I don't understand." "He was hoping for scandal, Mrs. Carrigan, something he could use against someone else. When I couldn't provide it, he became quite insistent that I reconsider my account of recent events." Mrs. Henley's hands twisted her reticule. "He suggested that my memory might improve with proper encouragement." The implications were clear. Caldwell was pressuring Mrs. Henley to fabricate the very rumors she'd been threatening to spread, and the landlord was discovering that being on the wrong side of dangerous men was considerably less pleasant than she'd anticipated. "What did you tell him?" Josie asked. "The truth, that you paid your rent late but caused no trouble, that I evicted you for financial reasons, not moral ones." Mrs. Henley's voice dropped to a whisper. "But I don't think he believed me, and I don't think he's the sort of man who accepts disappointment gracefully." As Mrs. Henley hurried away, obviously regretting her involvement in whatever web she'd stumbled into, Josie realized that the situation was spiraling beyond anyone's control. Caldwell wasn't just looking for Whit, was trying to create a scandal that would force Whit into the open, using her reputation as leverage. The game had changed, and she was no longer just a pawn. She was the prize they were fighting over, whether she wanted to be or not. Henrik's nephew never made it to the Henderson place. Pastor Williams delivered the news 3 days later, his face grim as winter stone. Young Eric had been found beaten senseless on the trail, his wagon overturned, and his supplies scattered across the frozen ground. He was alive, but barely, and the message meant for Whit was gone. "Caldwell's work?" Josie asked, though she already knew the answer. "Almost certainly. Eric's still unconscious, but the doctor says he'll recover." Eventually, Pastor Williams sank into the chair beside her cot, suddenly looking every one of his 63 years. "Whoever did this wanted to send a clear messagino. One helps Whit Maddox without paying a price." Josie pressed her hand against her belly, feeling the baby's restless movements as if the child sensed her distress. "We have to warn him ourselves." "Josie, you can't possibly make that ride in your condition. It's 20 miles over rough terrain, and winter's coming on hard." "Then what do you suggest? That we leave him out there, unaware that Caldwell's closing in?" Before Pastor Williams could answer, the church door burst open, admitting a gust of frigid air and a figure Josie barely recognized. Whit stood in the doorway, his face haggard with exhaustion and something deeper a fury, so cold it made the winter wind seem warm by comparison. "I heard what happened to Eric," he said without preamble. "Are you hurt?" The concern in his voice, the way his eyes swept over her, as if cataloguing every detail of her welfare, made something in Josie's chest tighten dangerously. "I'm fine. But Whit, you shouldn't be here. If Caldwell's men see you—" "Let them see me." His voice carried a hardness she'd never heard before. "I'm tired of hiding while good people suffer for my problems." He looked different than the last time she'd seen him, stronger, yes, but also transformed in ways that had nothing to do with physical healing. This was Whit Maddox, not the broken stranger she'd nursed back to health. Power radiated from him like heat from a forge, and she was reminded forcefully of exactly who she'd been dealing with. Pastor Williams rose, extending his hand in greeting. "Mr. Maddox, I'm glad to see you've recovered, though I wish the circumstances were better." "Pastor." Whit's handshake was brief, his attention focused entirely on Josie. "I need to know everything." What Caldwell said, what he threatened, how much danger you're in because of me. Josie told him about Caldwell's visit, about the veiled threats and Mrs. Henley's frightened confession. As she spoke, she watched his expression grow darker, saw his hands clench and unclench with barely controlled rage. "That's enough," he said when she finished. "This ends now." "What do you mean?" Pastor Williams asked. Whit was quiet for a long moment, staring into the small fire that warmed the back room. When he spoke, his voice was measured, deliberate, the voice of a man making decisions that would change everything. "There's something I haven't told you, about why Caldwell wants me dead, about what's really at stake here." He turned to face them both. "My father died 6 months ago. Heart attack, sudden and unexpected. I inherited everything, the ranches, the water rights, the business interests that make the Maddox name mean something in this territory." Josie felt her breath catch. "You're not just the heir anymore." "No, I'm the head of the family now, which makes me a very different kind of target." Whit's smile was sharp as a blade. "Caldwell represents a consortium of Eastern investors who want to buy up water rights across Wyoming Territory. They've been acquiring properties through intimidation and violence, forcing small ranchers to sell at fractions of their land's worth. And your family's holdings are the prize they really want," Pastor Williams said, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Exactly. Control our water rights, and they control the future of ranching in 3 counties. But there's a complication they didn't anticipate." Whit's expression grew thoughtful. "My father was a cautious man, especially after my mother died. He built provisions into his will that make it very difficult for the property to be sold or transferred under duress." "What kind of provisions?" Josie asked. "The kind that require the head of the family to be married and settled before making any major business decisions. My father believed that a man with a family to protect would make more careful choices than a bachelor with nothing to lose." The implications of his words hit Josie like a physical blow. "So they need you dead or discredited before you can marry and secure the inheritance. That was the plan. Beat me to death, make it look like a robbery gone wrong, then move on my holdings while the estate was in probate." Whit's voice was grim. "But you saved my life, and that changed everything." Pastor Williams leaned forward, his expression intent. "But surely you can marry anyone, establish the family stability your father required." "Not anyone," Whit said quietly, his eyes finding Josie's. "The will is very specific. The marriage has to be genuine, witnessed by community members, and the bride has to be someone of good character who's demonstrated her commitment to the family's welfare." Josie's heart began to pound. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that you've already met every requirement my father laid out, even though neither of us knew it at the time." Whit stepped closer, his voice gentle but urgent. "You saved my life at great personal cost. You've shown more courage and character than anyone I've ever known. And every person in this town can testify to your good standing in the community." The room seemed to tilt around her. "You're not suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything." Whit knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "I'm asking, Josie Carrigan, will you marry me?" The words hung in the air like something fragile and impossible. Josie stared at him, searching his face for some sign that this was a fever dream or a cruel joke, but she found only sincerity and something that might have been hope. "This is insane," she whispered. "Is it? Think about it. Married to me, you'd have security, protection, a home for your child. Our child, legally, which means he or she would inherit alongside any children we might have together." His thumbs traced across her knuckles, gentle and warm. "And I'd have what my father wanted, a wife who chose me for who I am, not what I own." Pastor Williams cleared his throat diplomatically. "It's certainly an unconventional proposal." "Everything about this situation has been unconventional," Whit said, not taking his eyes off Josie. "But that doesn't make it wrong." Josie's mind raced, trying to process what he was offering. Marriage to one of the most powerful men in Wyoming Territory, security for her unborn child, an end to the poverty and uncertainty that had defined her life since Samuel's death. It was everything she'd never dared to dream of, handed to her like a gift from heaven. But gifts this large always came with a price. "What about love?" she asked quietly. The question seemed to surprise him. "What about it?" "This marriage you're proposing, it's a business arrangement, a solution to both our problems. But what happens when the immediate crisis is over? When Caldwell is dealt with and your inheritance is secure, what then?" Whit was quiet for a long moment, considering her words. "I don't know," he said finally. "I know that I've spent more time thinking about you in the past week than any other person in my life. I know that seeing you reduced to living in charity quarters because of my problems makes me angrier than I've ever been. I know that when I imagine my future, you're in it." He paused, his grip on her hands tightening slightly. "But you're right, this isn't a proposal born of romance. It's born of necessity and mutual respect and the hope that those things might be enough to build something real on. And if they're not enough, then we'll have solved our immediate problems and gained time to figure out the rest." His smile was rueful. "I'm not offering you a fairy tale, Josie. I'm offering you partnership with a man who values what you've shown him about courage and kindness. The rest, love, contentment, happiness, those are things we'd have to discover together." The honesty in his words was almost more compelling than pretty promises would have been. This wasn't a man trying to sweep her off her feet with romantic nonsense. This was Whit Maddox, proposing a merger of their respective needs and hopes, acknowledging the risks while offering substantial rewards. But beneath the practical considerations, Josie recognized something else, something that had been growing between them since that first night, when she'd bandaged his wounds by firelight. Attraction, yes, but deeper than that. Recognition, the sense that they understood each other in ways that had nothing to do with their different circumstances. "There's something else," Whit said, as if reading her thoughts. "The will contains a marriage certificate template that transfers half of everything directly to my wife's name. Not a dowry or an allowance, but actual ownership. If you marry me, you'd be my equal partner in every sense that matters." The offer was staggering. Half ownership of an empire, simply for saying yes to a man she'd known for less than 2 weeks. It was the kind of proposition that could change not just her life, but the life of every child she might ever have. "Why?" she asked. "Why are you really doing this?" Whit released her hands and stood, moving to the small window that looked out over the town. "Because I've spent my entire life surrounded by people who wanted something from me. My money, my influence, my family's power. They smiled and agreed and told me what they thought I wanted to hear, and I never knew which of them would stand by me when things got difficult." He turned back to face her, his expression more open than she'd ever seen it. "But you didn't know who I was when you saved my life. You had nothing to gain and everything to lose, and you did it anyway. That kind of courage, that kind of character, it's worth more than all the water rights and cattle ranches in Wyoming Territory." The room fell silent, except for the wind outside and the soft crackling of the fire. Josie closed her eyes, trying to think past the overwhelming magnitude of what he was offering. This was her chance to escape poverty forever, to give her child opportunities she'd never dreamed possible. But it was also a leap into the unknown with a man who, for all his apparent sincerity, remained largely a mystery to her. When she opened her eyes, both men were watching her with expressions of careful neutrality, waiting for her decision. The wooden cross Samuel had carved lay warm in her palm, and she found herself wondering what her first husband would think of this impossible turn of events. Samuel had always told her to trust her instincts, to choose courage over comfort when the choice presented itself. And her instincts told her that Whit Maddox was a good man caught in terrible circumstances, offering her the same kind of partnership that had made her marriage to Samuel so precious. "All right," she said quietly. "Yes, I'll marry you." The transformation in Whit's face was immediate and profound relief, gratitude, and something that might have been joy flooding his features. "You mean it?" "I mean it." Josie managed a shaky smile. "Though I reserve the right to change my mind if you turn out to be secretly terrible." "That's fair," he said, and for the first time since she'd known him, Whit Maddox laughed. The news of Josie's engagement to Whit Maddox spread through Cedar Falls like wildfire through dry grass. By the next morning, the entire town was buzzing with speculation, disbelief, and in some quarters, outright scandal. A pregnant widow marrying Wyoming Territory's most eligible bachelor. It was the stuff of dime novels, too fantastic to be real. But the leather-bound business ledger Whit had produced, documenting the vast scope of his holdings and the legal requirements for marriage, made it impossible to dismiss as a romantic fairy tale. This was serious business, with consequences that would ripple far beyond their personal lives. "Half the women in the territory will hate you," Pastor Williams observed as he helped Josie review the marriage documents. "The other half will want to know your secret." Josie traced the intricate legal language with her finger, still struggling to believe the papers were real. "I don't have a secret. I was just in the right place at the right time to help someone who needed it." "That's more rare than you might think," Whit said from his position by the window, where he'd been watching the street for signs of Caldwell's men. "Most people help only when it's convenient or profitable. You helped when it cost you everything." The wedding preparations began immediately, driven by necessity rather than romance. Every day they delayed gave Caldwell more time to organize whatever response he was planning, and Whit was certain the man wouldn't give up easily. Too much money and power were at stake for the consortium to simply accept defeat. But even a hasty wedding required certain preparations, and those preparations created their own complications. Josie needed a dress, something befitting her new station but appropriate for her condition. The town's one remaining seamstress, Mrs. Patterson, was thrilled to take on such prestigious work, but her excited chatter about fabrics and lace made Josie feel like she was planning someone else's life. "What about flowers?" Mrs. Patterson asked, her needle flying through the silk Whit had somehow procured from the next county. "November weddings are challenging, but we might find some late chrysanthemums, or perhaps dried lavender." "Whatever you think best," Josie said, overwhelmed by details that seemed simultaneously crucial and completely irrelevant. How could she care about flowers when armed men might descend on the town at any moment? Whit understood her distraction. He'd arranged for additional security men he trusted, who'd worked for his family for years to watch the approaches to town. But his attention was divided between protecting her and conducting the complicated business of transferring half his empire to her name. "The paperwork has to be filed in 3 different counties," he explained during one of their planning sessions. "My lawyers are handling it, but there are timing issues. Everything has to be properly recorded before the wedding, or the marriage won't trigger the inheritance protections." "And if something goes wrong with the paperwork?" Pastor Williams asked. "Then we'll be married, but I'll still be vulnerable to Caldwell's scheme." Whit's expression was grim. "Which means Josie will be vulnerable too as my wife." The thought sent a chill through Josie that had nothing to do with the November weather. She was gambling her future and her child's future on legal documents and the honesty of a man she'd known for 2 weeks. If Whit was playing some deeper game, if his apparent sincerity masked darker intentions, she would be completely at his mercy. But when she watched him working tirelessly to ensure her protection, when she saw the genuine concern in his eyes every time he looked at her, those doubts felt like betrayals of something precious. Whatever else Whit Maddox might be, he wasn't a man who would deliberately harm a woman who'd shown him kindness. The revelation of their engagement had unexpected effects throughout the community. Mrs. Henley, who'd been avoiding Josie since Caldwell's visit, suddenly appeared with an offer to help with wedding preparations. Her motivations were transparently self-serving association with the future. Mrs. Maddox could only improve her standing, but Josie found her efficiency useful despite her character. "I've arranged for the church to be decorated," Mrs. Henley announced, with the authority of someone reclaiming lost territory. "Nothing too elaborate, given the circumstances, but appropriate for a woman of your soon-to-be station." More interesting was the reaction from townspeople who'd known Josie for years. Some were genuinely happy for her, understanding that the marriage represented security for a woman who'd faced genuine hardship. Others were clearly struggling with the dramatic change in her circumstances, unsure how to relate to someone who would soon wield considerable influence. Dr. Morrison, who'd attended Samuel's final moments, sought her out on the third day of preparations. "I wanted to check on your health," he said, his examination both professional and paternal. "This has been a stressful time, and stress isn't good for expectant mothers." "I'm managing," Josie assured him, though privately she acknowledged that the constant tension was taking its toll. She was sleeping poorly, eating little, and feeling the baby's movements more strongly, as if the child sensed the upheaval surrounding its impending arrival. "The baby's position is good," Dr. Morrison reported after his examination, "but you're carrying lower than before, which suggests delivery might come sooner than expected, within weeks rather than months." The news added another layer of urgency to their plans. If the baby came before the marriage was properly established, it would complicate the legal protections Whit's father had built into the inheritance requirements. They needed to complete the wedding, transfer the properties, and establish their new household before natural events forced additional changes. But it was Sarah Mitchell's unexpected visit that provided the most insight into what Josie's new life might look like. The young bride, still glowing from her recent wedding, arrived with what she called a social duty to the future Mrs. Maddox. "You'll need to understand how things work in society circles," Sarah explained earnestly. "The ladies you'll be associating with, the expectations for charity work and social functions. It's quite different from what you're used to." The careful phrasing couldn't disguise the underlying message. Josie would be entering a world where her background as a poor widow would mark her as an outsider, regardless of her new wealth and status. The women of Wyoming Territory's elite would be watching for signs that she didn't belong, waiting for missteps that would confirm their suspicions about hasty marriages and social climbing. "What would you recommend?" Josie asked, genuinely curious about this aspect of her future she hadn't considered. "Caution," Sarah said bluntly. "Don't try to change too much too quickly. Let your actions speak louder than expensive clothes or grand gestures. The respect you'll need as Mrs. Maddox has to be earned, not bought." It was good advice, though it highlighted yet another challenge Josie would face. Marrying Whit would solve her immediate problems, but it would create entirely new ones. She would spend years, perhaps decades, proving she deserved the position chance had thrust upon her. The arrival of Whit's lawyers on the fourth day brought both relief and new tensions. The documents were ready, the property transfers prepared, but the legal complexity was staggering. Josie found herself signing papers that transferred ownership of land she'd never seen, businesses she didn't understand, and water rights that controlled the fate of entire communities. "This ranch alone," the chief lawyer explained, pointing to a map spread across Pastor Williams's kitchen table, "controls water access for 30 smaller operations. Your decisions about water allocation will affect hundreds of families." The responsibility was overwhelming. Josie had spent months worrying about her own rent payments, and now she was being handed control over resources that could make or break entire townships. The scope of it made her feel simultaneously powerful and terrified. "You don't have to make any major decisions alone," Whit assured her that evening as they reviewed the final papers. "I'll be there to guide you through the business aspects until you're comfortable with them. And if something happens to you." The question had been haunting her since she'd learned about Caldwell's willingness to use violence. "If this consortium decides that eliminating both of us is the solution to their problem." Whit's expression grew serious. "Then the properties transfer to any children we have, held in trust until they come of age. And the trust is administered by people I've chosen specifically for their integrity and independence from outside influence. People like Pastor Williams, among others. My father believed in building multiple layers of protection." Whit smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He was a cautious man who'd lived through enough violence to understand that good intentions aren't always enough to protect what matters. As the wedding day approached, Josie found herself caught between anticipation and dread. The practical benefits of the marriage were undeniable security for her child, protection from Caldwell's threats, partnership with a man she'd come to respect and, if she was honest, care for more deeply than wisdom suggested. But the emotional cost was becoming clear as well. This marriage would end her connection to Samuel's memory in ways that felt like a second loss. She would take a new name, enter a new world, become a different person than the woman who'd loved and lost and struggled to survive. The transformation was necessary, but it was also a kind of death, the death of Josie Carrigan, seamstress and widow, to make room for the birth of Mrs. Whit Maddox, partner in empire. On the final night before the wedding, as she sat in the church back room surrounded by the trappings of her old life, Josie held Samuel's wooden cross and allowed herself to grieve for the simple dreams she was leaving behind. Tomorrow she would marry a man she barely knew, for reasons that had as much to do with survival as affection. It was the right choice, perhaps the only choice, but it was also the end of the life she'd built with her first husband's memory. Outside, Whit's security men maintained their watch, and somewhere in the darkness, Caldwell's forces were probably planning their next move. In a few hours, she would walk down the aisle toward a future she couldn't fully imagine, carrying a child who would inherit a fortune built on her act of simple kindness to a stranger. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was about to become one of the most powerful women in Wyoming Territory because she'd once been too compassionate to leave a beaten man to die in the cold. Samuel would have appreciated that the idea that doing right could lead to rewards beyond imagining, even when those rewards came disguised as impossible choices and terrifying responsibilities. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, and a new identity. But tonight, Josie Carrigan allowed herself to remember the woman she'd been and to hope that the woman she was becoming would prove worthy of both the trust placed in her and the love she was slowly, carefully beginning to feel for the complicated man who'd offered her his empire. The wedding morning dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crystalline light that made everything seem sharp-edged and significant. Josie woke to the sound of horses in the street more than usual. For a quiet Sunday in Cedar Falls, felt her stomach clench with something that might have been anticipation or terror. Mrs. Patterson arrived at dawn with the finished wedding dress, a creation that transformed fine silk into something approaching magic. The fabric had been cut to accommodate Josie's condition while maintaining an elegance that seemed impossible given the time constraints. The seamstress had worked thread of gold into the bodice, creating patterns that caught the morning light, like captured sunshine. "It's beautiful," Josie whispered, running her fingers over the intricate embroidery. "It's appropriate," Mrs. Patterson corrected with satisfaction. "A dress fit for the woman who'll be mistress of half Wyoming Territory by sunset." The words sent another flutter of nerves through Josie's chest. In a few hours, she would legally own ranches she'd never seen, control water rights that determined the fate of communities, wield influence she'd never sought or prepared for. The transformation from struggling seamstress to territorial power broker would be complete. Pastor Williams knocked softly before entering, his expression mixing joy with concern. "How are you feeling, child?" "Like I'm about to jump off a cliff and hope someone catches me," Josie admitted. "That's not entirely inaccurate," the pastor said gently, "but you're jumping toward a man who's already proven he'll catch you when you fall." As Mrs. Patterson helped her into the dress, Josie caught sight of herself in the small mirror Mrs. Henley had provided. The woman looking back at her was almost a strange relegant, composed, carrying herself with a dignity that seemed to come from the clothes themselves. The transformation was startling and somehow final, as if putting on the dress had completed the metamorphosis from Josie Carrigan to the future Mrs. Maddox. "There," Mrs. Patterson said, stepping back to admire her work. "Now you look like what you're about to become." A commotion in the street drew their attention to the window. A dozen riders had arrived in town, well-dressed men on quality horses who carried themselves with the confidence of money and authority. But something about their formation and the way they surveyed the town suggested they weren't here for the wedding celebration. "Caldwell," Pastor Williams said grimly. Josie's blood ran cold. "He's here, now?" "Looks like he's decided to make his move while the town's distracted by wedding preparations." Pastor Williams moved away from the window, his expression troubled. "I need to warn Whit." But before he could leave, another figure appeared on the street, Whit himself, dressed in his finest clothes, but moving with the alert tension of a man expecting trouble. He approached Caldwell's group with the steady confidence of someone who'd been anticipating this confrontation. From her window, Josie could see the two men talking, though she couldn't hear their words. Whatever Caldwell was saying clearly wasn't friendly. His gestures were sharp, aggressive, and several of his men had positioned themselves strategically around the conversation. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a final ultimatum. Whit's response was equally clear. He stood straighter, his voice carrying across the street with unmistakable authority, and whatever he said made Caldwell's face flush with anger. The confrontation was escalating exactly as they'd feared it would. "I have to get down there," Josie said, starting toward the door. "Absolutely not," Mrs. Patterson said firmly. "You're getting married in 2 hours, and you're not risking your life or your babies by walking into the middle of a range war. But if something happens to Whit, then you'll be a very wealthy widow with the resources to see that justice is done," Pastor Williams said with surprising steel in his voice. "But right now, the best thing you can do is stay safe and let him handle this." The conversation in the street was growing more heated. Caldwell had dismounted and was standing close to Whit, jabbing his finger toward the church, clearly making threats. Whatever leverage he thought he had, he was playing it now, trying to force Whit's hand before the wedding could proceed. But Whit wasn't backing down. If anything, he seemed to be growing more confident, his posture relaxed, even as the tension around him escalated. When he smiled at something Caldwell said, Josie felt a chill of recognition. This was Whit Maddox in his element, a man who'd spent his life dealing with threats and intimidation from people who underestimated him. The sound of more horses drew everyone's attention to the far end of Main Street. A larger group was approaching, at least 20 riders, wearing the kind of practical gear that suggested they were working cowboys rather than hired guns. As they drew closer, Josie could see they were led by a woman riding a magnificent chestnut mare. "Elizabeth," Whit called out, his voice carrying genuine warmth for the first time that morning. The woman swung down from her horse with the fluid grace of someone who'd been born in the saddle. She was perhaps 40, with prematurely silver hair and the kind of bearing that commanded immediate respect. When she spoke to Caldwell, her voice was pitched low, but every man in the street seemed to lean in to hear her words. "Who is that?" Josie asked. Pastor Williams was smiling for the first time all morning. "That would be Elizabeth Maddox Thornton, Whit's older sister, and unless I'm much mistaken, those are Maddox ranch hands behind her." The dynamics in the street shifted dramatically with Elizabeth's arrival. Caldwell's dozen men suddenly looked outnumbered and outgunned, facing a force that included some of the most experienced ranch hands in the territory. But more importantly, Elizabeth's presence seemed to transform Whit himself. The careful reserve Josie had always sensed in him melted away, replaced by the confidence of a man backed by family and tradition. "Gentlemen," Elizabeth's voice carried clearly in the crisp morning air, "I believe you're trespassing on private property. The Maddox family owns significant interests in this town, and we don't appreciate uninvited guests disrupting our business." Caldwell's response was lost in the wind, but his agitation was obvious. Whatever plan he'd had for intimidating Whit into submission was crumbling in the face of superior numbers and local support. Several townspeople had emerged from their homes and businesses, drawn by the commotion, and their allegiances were becoming clear. This was their town, and Caldwell was the outsider. "I should introduce myself," Josie said suddenly. "If she's going to be my sister-in-law, and if this confrontation is about our marriage, then she has a right to know who I am." "Josie," Pastor Williams began, but she was already moving toward the door. "The situation's changing too fast for caution," she said firmly, "and I won't hide behind other people while my future is being decided in the street." Mrs. Patterson caught her arm. "At least let me come with you. A woman in your condition shouldn't be walking into a confrontation alone." Together, the three of them made their way down to the street level, where the conversation had taken on the formal tones of a business negotiation, though one conducted between armed camps. Elizabeth was speaking when they emerged from the church. "Understand that my brother's personal affairs are family business, Mr. Caldwell. If your employers have grievances with our water rights or property holdings, they can file proper legal challenges through the territorial courts. This goes beyond legal challenges," Caldwell replied, his voice tight with frustration. "Your brother's marriage today will trigger inheritance provisions that make any future negotiations impossible. Only if you were planning to negotiate through violence and intimidation," Whit said calmly, "legal negotiations remain available regardless of my marital status." It was then that Elizabeth noticed Josie approaching, and her expression shifted from businesslike authority to unmistakable curiosity. The two women studied each other across the width of Main Street. Elizabeth assessing the pregnant woman in the elaborate wedding dress, Josie trying to read the face of the woman whose approval might determine her future happiness. "You must be Josie," Elizabeth said, her voice carrying warmth that seemed genuine. "I'm Elizabeth Thornton, Whit's sister. I apologize for arriving unannounced on your wedding day." "I'm glad you're here," Josie replied, surprising herself with the truth of it. "Your brother could use family support right now." Elizabeth's smile was sudden and transformative. "I suspect my brother has had more support than he realized all along. The question is whether Mr. Caldwell and his associates are prepared to accept that their intimidation tactics have failed." The confrontation had reached its crucial moment. Caldwell was outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and rapidly running out of options. His plan had depended on isolating Whit and using threats against Josie to force compliance. But with Elizabeth's arrival and the clear support of the community, that strategy had collapsed. "This isn't over," Caldwell said finally, his words carrying the weight of a promise rather than a threat. "No," Whit agreed, "but it's changed. You came here thinking you were dealing with a man alone and vulnerable. Now you know better." As Caldwell and his men prepared to leave, Elizabeth moved to stand beside her brother, her presence clearly protective. The message was unmistakable. The Maddox family stood united, backed by resources and loyalty that couldn't be easily overcome. "Shall we proceed with the wedding?" Pastor Williams asked mildly, as if armed confrontations in the street were a normal part of Sunday morning services. But even as the immediate crisis passed, Josie could see the calculation in Caldwell's eyes as he mounted his horse. This battle was over, but the war was far from finished. Her marriage to Whit would protect them legally, but it would also make them both permanent targets for a consortium that had already invested too much to simply walk away. The realization should have terrified her. Instead, as she watched Whit and Elizabeth standing shoulder to shoulder against their enemies, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months, the strength that comes from belonging to something larger than yourself. The church had never looked more beautiful. Word of the morning's confrontation had spread through Cedar Falls like wildfire, and what might have been a modest ceremony, attended by a handful of townspeople, had transformed into something approaching a celebration of defiance. Families who had initially been uncertain about the sudden engagement now filled the pews, their presence a clear statement of support for the couple who had faced down outside intimidation. Elizabeth had taken charge of the final preparations with the efficiency of someone accustomed to managing complex situations under pressure. Within an hour of Caldwell's departure, she had transformed the simple church decorations into something worthy of territorial society, using resources that seemed to appear from nowhere. 20 years of organizing charity events, she explained to Josie as they made final adjustments to the wedding dress. You learn to work miracles with very little notice. The two women had taken to each other with surprising ease. Elizabeth possessed the same direct honesty that Josie had come to value in Whit, combined with a warmth that spoke of genuine family affection rather than mere social obligation. "I have to ask," Elizabeth said as she helped arrange Josie's hair, "are you certain about this? Marriage to my brother comes with complications most women never have to consider." "I'm certain," Josie replied, and was surprised to realize she meant it completely, not because it's safe or simple, but because it's right, for both of us. Elizabeth's hands stilled in Josie's hair. "That's exactly what I hoped you'd say." Through the small window, they could see Whit pacing in the churchyard, his formal clothes unable to disguise the tension in his movements. The confrontation with Caldwell had gone better than anyone had dared hope, but they all knew it was only the beginning. The consortium wouldn't give up their plans simply because one intimidation attempt had failed. "He's been alone too long," Elizabeth said quietly, following Josie's gaze. "Our parents' deaths, the responsibility of the inheritance, the constant pressure from people who want to use him for their own purposes, been wearing on him in ways he won't admit." "He's stronger than he knows," Josie said. "Yes, but strength without companionship becomes isolation. What you're giving him today isn't just legal protection or business partnership, it's the chance to stop carrying everything alone." The church bells began to ring, calling the community to witness a marriage that had implications far beyond the personal happiness of two people. As Josie made her way to the church doors, she could see that the pews were packed not just with familiar faces from Cedar Falls, but with strangers' ranch hands and business associates who had ridden in with Elizabeth, creating an instant congregation of supporters. Pastor Williams waited at the altar beside Whit, both men wearing expressions of solemn joy appropriate to the occasion. But it was Whit's face that captured Josie's attention as she began her walk down the aisle. The careful reserve she'd grown accustomed to had been replaced by something approaching wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe this moment was real. The traditional words of the marriage ceremony took on unusual weight given the circumstances surrounding them. When Pastor Williams spoke of supporting each other through prosperity and adversity, the congregation knew they were witnessing vows that would be tested sooner rather than later. When he mentioned the sacred nature of the commitment being made, everyone present understood that this marriage would be scrutinized and challenged by forces beyond the church walls. But it was the moment when Whit and Josie exchanged rings that transformed the ceremony from a business arrangement into something deeper. The matching bands were simple gold, but they had been engraved with an intertwining pattern that seemed to symbolize lives becoming permanently connected. "With this ring," Whit said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent church, "I give you not just my name and my protection, but my respect, my partnership, and my promise to value what you've shown me about courage and compassion." When Josie's turn came, she found herself speaking words she hadn't planned, but that felt absolutely true. "With this ring, I give you my trust, my loyalty, and my commitment to help you build something worthy of the sacrifices that brought us to this moment." The kiss that sealed their marriage was gentle, almost tentative, but it carried the weight of a promise made in full awareness of its consequences. When they turned to face the congregation as husband and wife, the applause that erupted was more than polite celebration. It was a declaration of community support for a union that represented hope in the face of outside pressure. But even as they walked back down the aisle together, Josie was aware of the symbolic nature of the moment. She was no longer Josie Carrigan, the struggling seamstress who had saved a stranger's life. She was Mrs. Whit Maddox, co-owner of an empire and target of a consortium that would not easily accept defeat. The reception, hastily organized in the church hall, provided an opportunity for Josie to meet the people who would be part of her new life. Ranch foreman, who had worked for the Maddox family for decades, welcomed her with rough courtesy, while business associates assessed her with the calculating eyes of people trying to determine how this marriage might affect their own interests. "You've caused quite a stir in certain circles," one of Whit's lawyers informed her during the celebration. "Marriage to someone of your background has surprised people who expected him to choose a bride from established territorial families." "I hope they won't be too disappointed," Josie replied mildly, though she understood the message clearly. Her acceptance into Wyoming Territory's elite circles would depend as much on her future actions as on her new legal status. It was during the reception that the next crisis emerged. A young ranch hand approached Whit with news that made his face go hard with anger. "Fire at the north pasture," the man reported quietly. "Started about an hour ago, spreading fast toward the main water source." Elizabeth was beside them instantly, her expression grim. Caldwell? Has to be. Too convenient to be natural. And the wind's carrying it exactly where it would do the most damage. Whit's jaw was tight with suppressed fury. He's sending a message about what happens to people who oppose him. The implications were clear to everyone within hearing distance. Caldwell had retreated from the direct confrontation that morning, but he was continuing his pressure campaign through sabotage. If the fire reached the water source for that section of the ranch, it would force difficult choices about resource allocation that could affect dozens of smaller operations. "How many men do we have fighting it?" Elizabeth asked. "All we can spare, but it's not enough. The fire's moving faster than we anticipated." Josie felt the baby shift restlessly, as if sensing her distress. In the space of a few hours, she had gone from homeless widow to wealthy wife, to target of a campaign that included arson and potentially worse. The scope of her new responsibilities was becoming clear in ways that no legal document could have conveyed. "I need to go," Whit said, his attention already focused on the crisis at hand. "On your wedding day?" Pastor Williams protested. "Especially on my wedding day." Caldwell chose this timing deliberately, hoping to force me to choose between my new wife and my responsibilities to the people who depend on us. Whit's expression was resolute. He's about to learn that marriage to Josie makes me stronger, not weaker. As the wedding guests dispersed to deal with the emergency, Josie realized that her new life would be defined not by elegant social functions or comfortable domesticity, but by the constant challenges faced by people who controlled resources that others coveted. The romantic notion of marriage as an escape from problems had been replaced by the reality of marriage as a partnership in facing larger and more complex difficulties. But as she watched Whit organizing the response to Caldwell's latest attack, she felt no regret about the choice she had made. This was what she had signed up for, not just legal protection or financial security, but the opportunity to stand beside a man who was trying to do right in a world that often rewarded the opposite. The fire would be fought and hopefully contained. Caldwell would plan his next move, and she would begin learning how to wield the power and resources that were now hers by right of marriage and choice. The transformation from Josie Carrigan to Mrs. Whit Maddox was complete, but the real work of building their partnership was just beginning. 6 months later, Josie stood at the window of the main ranch house, watching the spring roundup with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to read the rhythms of ranch life. The baby little Samuel, named for her first husband with Whit's blessing, slept peacefully in the handmade cradle that had become the centerpiece of their family room. The fire that had marked their wedding day had been contained, though not before destroying valuable grazing land and forcing difficult decisions about water allocation. Caldwell's consortium had continued their pressure campaign through the winter, using legal challenges, economic manipulation, and occasional sabotage to test the resolve of the new partnership. But each challenge had only strengthened the bond between Whit and Josie, proving that their marriage was built on something more substantial than mutual convenience. "The eastern pasture looks better than I expected," Elizabeth said, joining Josie at the window. "Your suggestion about rotating the cattle through that section earlier than usual was exactly right." Josie smiled, cradling a cup of coffee that had become one of her small daily luxuries. "Samuel always said the land would tell you what it needed if you knew how to listen." The integration of her practical wisdom with Whit's business acumen had surprised everyone, including themselves. Where he saw grand strategies and territorial implications, she saw the human details that made those strategies work. Her suggestions about water allocation had prevented 3 smaller ranches from failing during the drought. Her insight into community relationships had helped build alliances that Caldwell's consortium couldn't break through intimidation. "Any word from town about the territorial governor's decision?" Josie asked. "Should come through today. If our petition was successful, Caldwell's group will lose their legal standing to challenge the water rights." Elizabeth's expression was cautiously optimistic. 6 months ago, I wouldn't have given us even odds. But the coalition you and Whit built has impressed people who matter. The coalition had been Josie's idea, born from her understanding of how communities actually functioned. Instead of fighting Caldwell's consortium through individual resistance, they had organized every small rancher, farmer, and business owner who depended on Maddox water rights. The result was a unified political force that territorial officials couldn't ignore, representing thousands of voters whose livelihoods were threatened by outside speculation. Little Samuel stirred in his cradle, making the soft sounds that meant he would be awake and hungry soon. Josie moved to pick him up, marveling as she did every day at the perfect health of the child who had been born into such uncertain circumstances. The difficult labor had lasted through the night, with Dr. Morrison and a midwife, Elizabeth, had summoned from Cheyenne working together to ensure both mother and baby survived. "He has your eyes," Elizabeth observed, settling into the chair beside the cradle. "But Whit's stubborn chin—" "God help us all," Josie said with mock horror, though privately she was pleased by any resemblance between her son and the man who had claimed him as completely as if he were biological father. The sound of horses in the yard announced Whit's return from his morning ride through the property. He'd taken to starting each day with a solitary survey of the ranch, partly for practical reasons and partly because the quiet time helped him think through the complex decisions that came with managing such vast holdings. "Papa's home," Josie murmured to the baby, who responded with the kind of focused attention that suggested he was already learning to recognize important voices. Whit entered with the easy confidence that had replaced his earlier wariness, his face lighting up at the sight of his wife and son. The transformation in him over the past months had been remarkable. Gone was the careful isolation that had defined his bachelor years, replaced by the warm engagement of a man who had found his place in the world. "Any news from the governor?" he asked, kissing Josie's forehead before reaching for the baby. "Elizabeth thinks we'll hear today," Josie replied, watching with continuing amazement as her powerful husband became completely absorbed in making silly faces at an infant who couldn't yet focus properly on anything more than 6 inches away. "Good. I'm tired of this uncertainty hanging over us." Whit settled into his favorite chair with little Samuel, continuing the ongoing conversation he'd been having with his son since the day of his birth. "Your mum has been working too hard on the allocation proposals. Tell her she needs more rest." "Your papa thinks I'm delicate," Josie informed the baby solemnly. "He hasn't yet learned that women who survive Wyoming winters are tougher than they look." It was the kind of gentle teasing that had become natural between them, built on mutual respect and growing affection that had surprised them both with its depth. The love hadn't come all at once. That would have been too much to expect from a marriage born of necessity, but it had grown steadily, nurtured by shared challenges and the daily intimacies of building a life together. The arrival of a territorial messenger interrupted their domestic tranquility, bringing news that would reshape the political landscape of Wyoming Territory. The governor had not only approved their petition regarding water rights, but had also launched a formal investigation into the consortium's business practices. Caldwell and his associates were facing charges ranging from land fraud to attempted extortion, and their influence in territorial affairs was effectively finished. "It's over," Whit said quietly, scanning the official documents. "The immediate threat, anyway." "What about the larger issue?" Josie asked. "Other groups with similar intentions?" "There will always be people who think violence and intimidation are acceptable business tactics," Elizabeth said pragmatically. "But our success in organizing resistance will make the territory less attractive to that kind of speculation. We've proven that communities can fight back effectively when they work together." As evening approached, the 3 adults settled into the comfortable routine that had evolved over the winter months. Elizabeth had extended her stay indefinitely, officially to help with ranch management, but really because she had fallen in love with her nephew and enjoyed the sense of family that had been missing since their parents' deaths. Little Samuel, fed and content, lay in his father's arms, while Josie worked on her latest project, a christening gown that combined fabric from her old life with materials that reflected her new circumstances. The blend of practical necessity and elegant beauty seemed appropriate for a child who would inherit both his mother's resilience and his father's resources. "I've been thinking about the Henderson place," Whit said, his voice taking on the thoughtful tone that meant he was working through a complex idea. "It's been empty since we moved you to safety there, but it's good land with potential." "What kind of potential?" Josie asked, though she suspected where his thoughts were leading. "The kind that could support a family. Maybe someone who needs a fresh start, who's proven they can work hard and make something from very little." He looked at her with the slight smile that had become her favorite expression on his face. "I was thinking about offering it to Henrik's nephew Eric as compensation for what happened to him. Or maybe to one of the young men from town who's been talking about starting a family but can't afford land prices." It was exactly the kind of decision that had made Josie fall in love with the man behind the Maddox name, the understanding that true wealth meant having the power to create opportunities for others, not just accumulating resources for yourself. "That's a beautiful idea," she said softly. As the baby drifted off to sleep and Elizabeth retired to her room, Josie and Whit found themselves alone with the peaceful satisfaction of a day well ended. Outside, the Wyoming wind carried the sounds of settled livestock and the promise of spring growth. Inside, the fire crackled quietly in the stone hearth that had become the heart of their home. "Any regrets?" Whit asked, the question that had become their evening ritual. "Only that it took a beating and an eviction notice to bring us together," Josie replied, settling into the circle of his arms. "You? Only that I waited so long to realize that the most important inheritance my father left me wasn't land or water rights or business connections." He pressed his lips to her hair, breathing in the familiar scent that had become synonymous with home. "It was the wisdom to recognize genuine love when it finally found me." Through the window, the first stars appeared over the vast expanse of territory that was their responsibility and their legacy. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove themselves worthy of the trust placed in them by communities throughout Wyoming. But tonight, in the warm circle of family and the quiet satisfaction of work well done, Josie Maddox allowed herself to feel something she hadn't experienced since Samuel's death. The deep peace that comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong. The baby's christening gown lay finished on her sewing table, ready for the ceremony that would formally welcome little Samuel into the community that had embraced his parents' unlikely love story. Like everything else in their new life, it represented the blending of past and future, the transformation of individual struggles into shared strength, and the enduring truth that sometimes the most important journeys begin with a simple act of compassion toward a stranger in need.